Afua, it's great to have you. So let me start with an introduction of you, although I know from the comments that lots of people already know who you are, read your books, your articles. So Afua Hirsch, award-winning writer, broadcaster, filmmaker, known for her work on Black culture, history, identity, and culture in the African diaspora and worldwide. Afua has been practicing lawyer, war correspondent, written multiple cover stories for Vogue, Time magazine, and its regular contributor to the New York Times and the UK Guardian newspaper. We are here today to discuss her book, British, on race, identity, and belonging. And I'm Magdalena Wasilewska, D&I coordinator, and I'm so thrilled to be here with you.
Thank you, Magdalena.
So, Afua, welcome to F5.
Thank you.
We're really excited, and thank you for sharing your book with us. And tell me, what inspired you to write this book?
I guess there are two different stories about why I wrote the book. And the first is a professional one. And that is that at the time I first thought about writing it was 2012. And it was a very specific time because Europe was still in the grip of recession, the credit crisis. And at that time, I was the West Africa correspondent for The Guardian. And I was living in Ghana, which had then the fastest growing economy in the world. And there were very many young diasporans who had moved to Ghana. And when I say diasporans, some of them were Black British Ghanaians, but others were from the Black diaspora more generally, from the Caribbean, African-American people. And they were moving to Ghana. They wanted to be part of this moment of joy that an African country was thriving. But among the British Ghanaians who'd moved back to Ghana, I really noticed a trend. And one side of it was positive, and they said that they had wanted to be part of a growing economy on the African continent. But one side of it was quite negative, and they said that they were leaving Britain to leave being British, that they never felt welcome in Britain, that they never felt that their careers could be limitless, that the opportunities were available to them. And these were people who were born in Britain, raised in Britain, educated in Britain, socialized in Britain. And it made me begin to think about what was going wrong with Britishness as an identity, that it was excluding so many of its core constituents. And as we know, the people who tend to move tend to be the people with energy ideas. They were many of the most talented graduates of their generation. And as I began to think about why Britishness was excluding the people I was meeting, it really made me reflect on myself. And I guess that's the second part of the answer, that when I really reflected on my own journey and my own identity, I had never felt comfortable owning Britishness, even though I was also unequivocally British. And that really sent me exploring what happens to identities like Britishness. And to do that, you have to understand the history of Britain, you have to understand the narratives in the contemporary political discourse, but it also made me reflect on a much more personal level about my heritage, my racial identities, and I say identities plural because I think many of us have multiple identities and they're complex and they're nuanced. And I didn't feel that there was a space in which we could confidently and comfortably talk about these identities. And I thought about how unhealthy that was. So a lot of the work in my book, it was storytelling, and that's what I do, but it was also actually creating a space and creating a language to have this discourse, because I passionately believe that we haven't been doing a good job of having those discourses, and it has really personal and political ramifications if we don't.
Yeah, I think it concerns each and every of us, and I like the notion of of multiple options of belonging. And what made me think is that in your book you answered a question, and I quote, so I will read that: does race even exist? And you said that it's like acknowledging that while it's a social construct, it's got attachment to it, and this attachment is by us, so therefore it's real. But can you share more what you mean by attachment?
Race is such a nebulous concept to discuss because it is nonsense. And it's always strange to start a conversation about race and identity by dismissing the concept of race as nonsense. And I'm not dismissing it, but if you just take the idea of race as a way of classifying humanity, there's a famous sociologist who said tutti frutti would be a better label for categorizing the human race than race. It's nonsensical. It doesn't correspond to any group of biological facts. There's no package of genes or chromosomes that denote racial identity. There are actually greater genetic differences within what we think of as ethnic groups and racial groups than there are between them. So it doesn't have any basis in scientific reality. But the reason that I don't dismiss it is because it was very deliberately invented as a social construct, and it was invented for a specific ideological purpose. That purpose was to justify colonialism and transatlantic slavery. And if you think about it, you can't persuade otherwise God-fearing, rational people to accept the system that builds itself on the trafficking of Black bodies unless you convince them that these bodies are not human, that they belong to a different subspecies, that they don't attract the same inviolable rights as other human bodies. And so that need to justify the project of colonialism gave us the categories of race. And alongside Blackness, which was denigrated, you also needed to create whiteness, which had connotations of entitlement, of privilege, of being somehow purer and more civilized. So these constructs were invented for that reason. And while the British Empire, like all other major European empires, disintegrated during the last century, the ideology that underpinned them has not. And if you look at the British Empire, for example, you could never have policed a quarter of the earth through military or police force. It wasn't through violence, it was through ideology. It was through persuading people that they actually were inferior, that being ruled by a European nation was better for them, that assimilating into those ideals was aspirational. That ideology has never actually been acknowledged. It's never been apologized for, and it's never been dismantled. And many of us, and I include myself in this, were raised by people who grew up in the empire under that conditioning, and it was internalized very deeply. So I think that we need to do more to understand the constructs we've been given. And what I write about in my book is that sometimes people understandably want to move on from this history. There's nothing I would love more than to move on from this. I would love for my daughter to know that she's growing up in a world where the ways in which she is categorized racially bear no outcome on her life. But we haven't done the work yet. You don't get to be post-racial until you've acknowledged the extent to which you've been racialized. And that work involves understanding what race is and how it affects each and every one of us. We've all been born into systems that are racialized. And until we can locate ourselves within that, understand the context and the content of those racial identities, we can't unpick them, we can't dismantle them. So it's frustrating because it's not the actual work. The actual work is the dismantling and moving forward and creating a fairer system. But we're still doing the pre-work, which is just acknowledging that those systems exist. And that's something that has been difficult to communicate because people aren't used to being asked to see it. And it's much more comfortable to say, I don't see race, and then the whole thing goes away. But obviously you can't solve a problem by claiming not to see it. It's a kind of obvious. So a lot of my work is helping people in that conversation because it is unfamiliar, because many people feel they don't have the tools, even the linguistic tools, to do that work.
And when you talk about linguistic, I was thinking about this colorblindness, where sometime that was meant to or was supposed to be the perfect option, right? No problem, we don't see color, we're colorblind. You call it racism light or covert racism. And I got the impression from the articles or the news broadcasts, etc., that was meant not by Europe, but the society as a magic solution.
And I can talk about this from quite a kind of esoteric perspective, but the reality is when I was growing up as a little Black girl, I had to square the circle of people on the one hand, racializing me, making comments about my name or my hair texture or my skin color, that clearly came from the baggage of these ideas of race. But on the other hand, telling me they didn't see race. And what that really was a form of gaslighting, because if you say you don't see race, you then remove somebody's right to own the fact that they are being racialized, to express how that affects them. So people who say that are often very well intentioned. You know, I think people who are actively or enthusiastically racist do see race and they enjoy seeing it and they enjoy discriminating against people based on it. Most of the people I've encountered in my life do not fall into that category. They are well intentioned. They want to live in a world where opportunity isn't distributed by race, but in their enthusiasm to enjoy that reality, they haven't done the more difficult work of seeing how our current system works. And unfortunately, we haven't earned the luxury of not seeing race yet. We haven't done the work that gets us there.
Are you hopeful?
I am. I think that, to be very honest with you, and I've been doing this work for a long time, I've seen more progress in the last 2 years than my entire professional lifetime put together. And again, it's not really the progress I'd like to see, but it's a start. And a very experienced veteran civil rights activist in the UK, an old man I was talking to, said to me shortly after the murder of George Floyd, he said, you know, the really great thing about this moment is that we've been at -10 when it comes to the conversation about racial equality, and now we're getting to 0. And he said that as if that was a really positive thing. And yes, it is. If you move from -10 to 0, that's still 10 steps. But it really struck a chord with me as a reflection on where we are, that there's only so much you can celebrate reaching 0. And I feel that that is where we've been, but we have made a huge amount of progress just getting to this space where people acknowledge that there is a conversation that needs to have, where people want to self-educate, they want to equip themselves with the tools to have this discourse. And I'm a real believer that as a society, you get the language you deserve. And one of the reasons I think that we find it difficult to talk about this in Britain is we have terrible language, and I'm conscious of it as I'm saying these things. I don't like any of the terms. Black and white are obviously legacies from slavery. I, as somebody with a white parent, self-identify as mixed heritage or mixed race, which implies that race is an actual thing that exists, that you can mix, which is obviously nonsense. The term people of color, many people dislike and find it, you know, a kind of legacy of the idea of colored, which is also a slavery era concept. So the language you have is terrible. And I do think you get the language you deserve. And we have not been having a high quality discourse about these subjects. And as a result, we haven't evolved a language that is a sophisticated way of identifying the things that we mean. And I don't think that's something one person can resolve. I think that language has to evolve out of a high quality discourse. And the more we embark upon it, the more we will become better at it.
Yeah, but I totally understand. At the same time, you know, in the back of my head, it's like changing language. That's huge. It's a huge amount of work, but I'm so happy that there is progress. There is always somewhere to go. And in the book, you describe, when it comes to race, Britain definitely has secrets. They lurk in the language, as you said, and the brickwork and the patterns of society, so that for those who are silent or desperate enough to listen and search, the clues gradually begin to reveal themselves. Very poetic, very true. We don't what you discussed totally. But you also say it takes carrying the baggage of racism to see racism. And this made me wonder, how would you encourage someone who is not Black to try to understand the lived experience of Black people without burdening Black people to educate them?
I think that's such an important question. And I think asking that question is a long way towards reaching an answer. I think there has been a perception, because it has been the people who are most viscerally or existentially affected by racism who've been doing this work. There is now a perception in the UK and in many places that it's our work, that it's the work that Black people do, that it's our problem, it's our struggle. And it's so important just for people to acknowledge that actually this is for everyone. If you want to live in a society that is fair, that is a meritocracy, that gives a next generation opportunity based on talent, ability, energy, ideas, that allows us to compete in a society where we are globalized and we are competing with nations that are able to draw in a positive way on the diversity of their populations. If you want to achieve that, then you have to see and dismantle systems of racism, and that these systems have been bad for everybody. They've been particularly toxic for many white people who haven't yet been able to understand the ways in which whiteness has disadvantaged them. So I think just understanding that this is everybody's work is really important. Understanding that actually many people who are minoritized have had no choice but to do this work, because from childhood you are othered, you are racialized, you have to make sense of it, you have to navigate it, you have to develop tools, you have to learn. Whereas many people who haven't had that experience have not been confronted with the necessity of this work. So it is often people who self-identify as white who really have the most work to do. And the other part of your question is equally crucial, that it's not something that you are entitled to have done for you by the Black and brown people you know. And, you know, many people who are minoritized have had the experience of white friends and colleagues asking or expecting them to explain to them, to educate them. And that really the positive thing to say is that it is now so much easier to go on that journey of self-education yourself. There is so much material, there are so many books, there are so many podcasts, there are so many films and documentary series, and everybody needs to do that work. And the reality is that unfortunately our education systems are not equipping us to do this. We're still not being taught in school, we're not being given the resources and materials by our educators, and that really is a symptom as well as a cause of the lack of progress we've made from the political leadership through every level of society. So it is incumbent on everyone to self-educate. And because none of us have had this education, we all have work to do. Just because you're Black or brown, it doesn't mean you have had the education you need to equip you. You're just probably likely to have reflected on it further because you haven't had the choice. So I think it's very important for everybody to realize they are located in this conversation. Everybody has an identity that has been racialized, and everybody has experienced the ways in which this system works. It's just a question of whether you're aware of it or not, and whether you understand it or not. And that's something that is a hugely fulfilling project to embark on. And I can say from personal experience, I am totally self-educated on these issues. Nobody ever taught them to me as a child. Nobody in my family or my personal life equipped me to do this work. And if I can do it, everyone can. And actually it's becoming a more and more fulfilling task because there's so much amazing material out there now.
Okay, so how can we do this? So what advice do you have for each individual who listens and will listen to our interview? What can we do? How can we fully address race?
There's a phrase that Americans use that I think is really apt, which is leaning into racial discomfort. I think that there has been, and many people have said this to me, they want to do this, but it's awkward, as if that's a reason not to do it. And the reality is it's because it's awkward that you must do it. And that awkwardness, that discomfort is something you can lean into and embrace. And I think just understanding that there is nothing wrong with feeling uncomfortable or ill-equipped or nervous about having these conversations, doing this work, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's exactly why you should. And I think it's really healthy that we can all acknowledge that there is an element of racial discomfort in having these conversations and doing this work. And once you acknowledge it and it's out there, that's something that bonds us all because we're all having to deal with it. And I think just naming that is a really helpful place to start. I think that it's really important for institutions to see that they are not culturally neutral. And, you know, I think this is something that comes up when we talk about diversity and inclusion, when we are trying to bring people from different backgrounds with different lived experiences and perspectives into a space. The emphasis is usually on those people, the diversity that they represent. What those people find when they come in, and I've been one of them, is that they are stepping into an organization that has a pre-existing culture. And that culture has often been characterized by whiteness. It's often been characterized by Eurocentric values. It's often been characterized by an assumption that certain Western global capitalist Eurocentric values are better. And that's the work that I think needs to be done at institutional level, to see the culture. What is the culture? Who does it favor? What is regarded as normal? What are people being asked to assimilate into? If you don't see that, you can't understand whether it creates a hostile space for people who don't share those values or don't have that experience, who are stepping in. And I've never seen an example of an institution that's done that work that hasn't benefited from it, that hasn't become more diverse, that hasn't become more effective, that hasn't become more inclusive for people of all backgrounds. And it's always fascinating that if you do this work when it comes to anti-racism, you find that you're also doing the work when it comes to LGBTQI, when it comes to religion, when it comes to other forms of minoritized identities. So everybody benefits if you do that work. I think allyship is really important and a really important concept, and moving away from the idea that it's something that you need to ask permission from Black people from, or you need to be educated by Black people on. And I think, you know, when I think about allyship, and there's been so much conversation about optical allyship, which I think is really helpful because it can be tempting to make it about yourself. When I think about allyship, I think about putting something on the line, being willing to risk something, because the reality is when you're a visible minority at work, you often have to face a penalty for standing up to your perspective or your values, because it's not what people are used to hearing. It can be regarded as threatening to the status quo. And as a visible minority, you're so conscious that you are jeopardizing potentially your relationships, your career progression, your reputation, that there's a cost, there's a real cost to owning that work. And so for me, allyship is when people who don't have to do that work choose to share the cost, choose to share the burden, because if you're not risking anything, you're not really sharing the work. So as a white ally, I would ask myself, what am I doing, and does it cost me anything? Am I risking anything? Am I sharing in that risk that the visible minority person is shouldering? Just seeing that and acknowledging it and beginning to think that way is really helpful. And the allyship that has made a material difference to me and other people around me has been when somebody has been willing to put themselves on the line to stand up for whatever it is that I'm advocating. So I think that's a really useful and very simple thought experiment. What does it cost me?
Sounds simple. I'm well aware that we as people don't like to be in uncomfortable positions, right? Is it for fear to offend other people, or is it about getting out of our comfort zone because you don't know what's there? And once you know, there are lots of uncomfortable discussions, as you said, all minorities, and in each and every company there is a minority.
I think that when it's uncomfortable, the more you maybe structure those conversations or those encounters can be really helpful. And if you look at many of the books now about allyship, like Nova Reid, The Good Ally, or How to Be Anti-Racist, Layla, I forget her last name, there are various books about being anti-racist, being an ally, and you'll notice that they actually follow a plan. It's quite a structured path. There are steps. And I think the reason for that, and I do recommend them, the reason for that is that it can be daunting if you've not been on this journey before, if you haven't been on it in a work context. And there are steps you can follow that guide you through it so that it's managed, it's structured. And I think that's helpful. I think in a workplace, if you want to do this work on anti-racism and allyship, it can be helpful to structure that as well. Sometimes structure it around a book that people read and can discuss together, a point of reference, because it is difficult to go from not having this conversation at all to going full on, trying to discuss and unpick everything. So I think also managing your expectations and doing it in a way that people feel comfortable with, whilst also acknowledging that discomfort by itself is not a reason not to do it. So it's that balance between leaning into racial discomfort, as I was saying, but also making sure it's a safe space that's managed and guided. And I think getting that balance, it's an art, not a science.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it. And this is why I love it so much. I love this approach that it's there. We have to acknowledge that it might be difficult, it might be uncomfortable, but we have resources. We can do this. We can talk, and it's surprising how it's all interwoven. It's past, present, future. We have to connect all of it to go forward. And actually, this is a theme throughout your work. It's like reconciling Britain with its past. And I loved how you described your motivations for examining the past. You wrote, reassessing British history is not about race, it's about integrity. It's not about separating out who to celebrate for the good and who to blame for the bad. It's about the fact that the past is linked to the present. And we talked about self-education and growing there. But what about British history? What do people who live in Britain, what can they do to re-educate themselves on the history of Britain? Like precisely this aspect. Is there anything they can do?
Yes, there's a huge amount that you can do. And I think just first of all, acknowledging that we are miseducated. At the moment, the current state of education discourses Britain is one of miseducation. So in the absence of educating yourself, you don't understand British history. And it is one of the reasons that I advocate for curriculum change, for a change in the national narrative, is because I actually think it's a huge act of neglect to fail to equip future generations of British people with the essential skills to navigate their own society, to understand why Britain looks the way it does, why the population is the population it is, why it has the cultural connotations, the atmosphere, even things that people regard as British, so many of which were created in the empire. So much of the very concept of Britishness was invented during imperial expansion. If you don't understand Britain's empire, just taking one example of a major area of British history, you can't understand the concept of modern Britishness, why Britain positions itself geopolitically the way it does, why it has the Commonwealth, why it's a member of NATO, why it was able to ally with the US to win the Second World War. These things are all fundamentally the story of the British Empire. And so it does feel like a deliberate miseducation to not equip people with understanding that. It's actually quite basic knowledge. But because we haven't been equipped with that by our education system, it is a task to embark on. And there are many wonderful books about Britain's history that I recommend. David Olusoga, Priyam Gopal. There are a multitude. And for me, actually, the classic book, Peter Fryer, Staying Power, which was written in the 1980s, which is the comprehensive story of Black people in Britain, which contains so many fascinating stories about the evolution of the British Isles, one of which I think often surprises people is that there were Africans in Britain before there were English people in Britain. And to understand that existentially Britain is not the nation it was portrayed as during the last 2 centuries. And it's really very recent that the ideas we now have of Britain as this indigenously white country, this kind of pinnacle of Anglo-Saxon superiority, it's actually quite a recent construct during the Victorian era. So I do recommend those books. Many of them have been made into TV series. And just actively seeking them out and realizing this is something that you can self-educate on. And again, it's actually fun to self-educate about British history. British history is far more fascinating than the version we've been taught. It's more complex and nuanced. And again, I think it kind of impoverishes us not to share that knowledge. But it is a source of obvious concern that rather than moving in a linear direction of progress, we have definitely been regressing when it comes to the political conversation about understanding British history. And, you know, it's easy to see why. I think British people have been addicted to a narrative of moral victory ever since the Second World War. And it's a very attractive narrative, raised with the idea that Britain is always on the right side of history. And it crowds out any space for facts, histories, knowledge that contradicts the idea that Britain was morally victorious, was morally right. So I think that it's made us a very fragile nation, being addicted to that narrative. And it's a narrative that we constantly tell ourselves through our celebrations, our commemorations, the way we think about the Second World War, the way we think about the period of empire. We much prefer a celebratory version of history rather than an honest version of history. And history is not a celebratory subject. It's not good or bad. It is a series of facts and events and the narratives that surround them and context that explain them. So I think that just understanding that we can't cut it as a nation, we can't be sophisticated people, we can't compete globally if we're too fragile to confront some basic facts about our history. And that's something that each and every one of us can address just by simply engaging with the stories that have been conveniently left out.
I guess it brings us back to language, because when you're saying about narrative was created or has been created using language. And there's lots of terminology used, as we discussed it in the beginning. New words are needed and new approach to them is needed. But I would like us to talk about the term BAME and the frequency with which you are asked about terminology. Because I'm sure you are asked a lot. And how do you respond?
BAME is a bit of a bugbear for me, and I know many other people, and I think it's not really the fault of the expression itself. And if you look at the roots of BAME, Black and minority ethnic, its origins are in Whitehall from data collection. Civil servants wanted a term that could aggregate people from ethnic minorities broadly, and that's the one they came up with. It was never designed to be a way we actually identify each other, conversation and in relationships. And I think, again, coming back to the point I was making earlier, the failure to have a sophisticated discourse around race has meant that we haven't evolved a good language. And into that void, totally inappropriate terms like BAME have been appropriated in the absence of anything better. So I wouldn't say it's anyone's fault. I think it's the collective failure to evolve the right terminology has meant we've had no choice but to reach for the wrong terminology. And then once you've got bad terminology, you just continue to use it badly. So, you know, people say, as a BAME person, how do you feel? And I've never looked in the mirror and seen a BAME person looking back at me. It's not, it doesn't mean anything. Nobody's identity corresponds to BAME. Similarly, we misuse the word diversity. I've been, you know, asked, as a diverse person, how do you feel about X? The idea that I'm a diverse person is, you know, I think just speaks to the failure to really grasp the meaning that's supposed to underpin these concepts. It's difficult to come up with alternatives on your own. I think it needs to be something that arises out of collective discourse. But for people who are minoritized, it can often present as just another microaggression, that you're being referred to with language that you don't recognize, doesn't mean anything, it doesn't correspond to any part of your identity. And it's constant. You know, you go into a space, you're BAME, you go into another space, you're diversity, you're all kinds of words that don't correspond to how you self-identify. And it's another thing that grates you and others you, I think, as a person who is minoritized moving through our society, that there are always these new and ugly terms that are being applied to you. So I think recognizing that, again, is really healthy. And also asking people how they self-identify is always a good way of avoiding it, because, you know, I'm fairly comfortable with self-identifying as Black, with self-identifying as mixed race, but many people dislike or some of those terms, and I can't give anyone permission to use a particular language on someone else. I think understanding that identity is something that you can't police from the outside, that we all get to self-identify, and we should have the right to self-identify with a language that we feel comfortable with. I think as we evolve a better language, it will be easier to have general terms that people do feel comfortable with, but at the moment they do feel very much imposed on us by political leadership or by social convention that feels outdated.
And there's something like the notion of political correctness. Right?
I think political correctness is one of those phrases that it's a bit like woke. It shouldn't be bad. It shouldn't be bad to be conscious about not offending people politically or socially. It shouldn't be bad to try to be awake to injustice. But somehow these phrases have been weaponized by an agenda that wants us to think we're being policed. We're not allowed to be racist and transphobic anymore. And isn't that terrible? No, I don't think it's terrible. I think it's good that you would now think twice about using a phrase which belittles or demeans or offends someone because of their identity. However, I think, again, this is not a project that has brought people with it. You know, there has never been a civil rights movement in the UK. There's never been a moment where really grappling with minoritized identities, with the injustices around them, with the history that has underpinned them. There's never been a moment where that's penetrated the national consciousness. It's never been part of a mainstream discourse. It's never been something that every person in every household has worked or struggled to grapple with. And so it's always been regarded as a bit of an unnecessary phenomenon in Britain, political correctness gone mad, wokeism, rather than a fundamental part of being a democracy, that you need to have a language that is appropriate and meaningful to do the work of addressing inequality. That should be a pretty basic requirement of a democratic society, but in Britain, we haven't quite got there yet.
Yeah. That seemed big, yes. The political, and yes, sometimes words are big, right? Good, bad, evoking emotions. And this next question will not be about the book, but when I was watching your interviews and reading your articles, one of the phrases that started to haunt me actually was the idea of "where are you from?" question. And I've been asked a lot. I come from Eastern Europe, travel to different countries, speak with multiple people, and it's usually one of the first questions I hear. And you said that even though this question seems like a conversation opener, right? Sometimes it might be perceived as not a welcoming question.
Yeah, I actually opened my book with this question, where are you from? Because it's such a metaphor, I think, for the experience of being, in my case, a middle-class Black person in Britain, that, again, it's something that people ask in what they think is a well-intentioned way. And again, I think if you are hostile towards someone, you don't ask them where they're from. You just assume that it's a place that you look down on. People who ask you where they're from usually do so with a genuine spirit of curiosity as a conversation starter, as you said. The problem is, when you are British, as I am, and Black as I am, you find yourself getting asked this question all the time, all the time. And I have many white British friends who, by the way, have fascinating heritage stories. They've got Jewish or Huguenot ancestors. They've traced their Viking heritage. You know, there are many fascinating immigration stories within people who are racialized as white in Britain. But they don't get asked. It's assumed that they're just British. And that is the underlying issue with the question, where are you from? It's not that there's anything wrong with being curious about each other's heritage. I'm fascinated by heritage. I've written a book about it. The problem is the underlying assumption that if you look like me, you must be from somewhere else, that if you look like me, your Britishness is conditional, that you need to explain it, that you can't just be British. And that's further aggravated by the fact that if, like me, you often say, I'm British, and they say, yeah, but where are you really from? It's kind of proving the point that subconsciously, I think we don't really believe that being Black and being British are compatible. They're kind of mutually exclusive. So that's the issue. It's the underlying belief that Britishness is at its core a white identity. That's what I'm challenging. And then there's the reality that if you go through life constantly being asked where you're from when you're British, you start to believe that you can't really be British, because if you were, why are people constantly asking you? And in my case, just from childhood, you start making up another answer. So, oh, obviously I'm not British. There must be another place that I'm from. I better find out where that is. And it removes your ability to create an identity for yourself in the country that you're from. I personally am very proud of my Ghanaian heritage, and I'm very proud to self-identify as a British Ghanaian, as a Black diaspora, and so many different, we all have so many different identities, overlapping identities. But the idea that I can't just be British if I choose to be is obviously problematic, since Britishness is the nationality I have had from birth. So I think it's just unpicking your motives when you ask someone that question. And, I know that people who are white but have foreign accents often get asked where they're from. But the difference is that you usually have to speak then before somebody asks you where you're from. In my case, they just look at me and assume that I can't really be British, that there must be an immigrant somewhere that they can identify, and that then it will make sense why I'm in the country. And as I said, there have been Black people in Britain for thousands of years. So whichever way you look at it, factually, emotionally, or from a perspective of national narrative building, there is no justification for that being required from people of color, that they should explain where they're from.
For me personally, when this question still lingers in my head and I'm more cautious where to use it. Of course, it's easier when you meet new people over Zoom because you already know they are not.
And I think I would just add, by the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about your origin stories or your identities in a context where everyone is sharing. I think the issue is when you single out the Black and brown people, and that's what we experience frequently. But if you are creating a space where everyone talks about their identity, I think that's wonderful. And actually, I think that's a really healthy way of embarking on this work. At work, for example, everybody has an identity, everybody has heritage, everybody has a cultural hinterland. That's something everyone can bring to the table. And I think making that an inclusive conversation is a really good way of bringing everyone into this work of what are our identities, where do they come from, what do they mean, how do they present, how do they affect us differently in this space. I think that's a way that everyone can do this work together.
It's so powerful when we think about workplace and people working together, because by default nowadays, we really do come from different backgrounds. However, we choose to have them, different identities. And the last question I have actually is the story that you tell about the workplace and being selected to come to talk to school children. And I laughed out loud thinking, what will I help? I mean, great for school kids, but how will that help the workplace to be more inclusive? So to recap all the things that you've said, Afua, what should organizations be doing to create a more diverse and inclusive workplace, in your opinion? But I'd like us to group it like the basics, and then advanced option. If we have the basics, what's next? So what should we start with and the next steps to follow?
The first thing for me is to analyze power and resources in the organization. So you can't seriously embark on the work of diversity and inclusion if you haven't been transparent about how power is distributed and what the racial and ethnic implications of that are. So many companies have more diverse entry levels, but at senior levels, when you get to C-suite or when you get to people who have serious decision-making power, you find that it's increasingly less diverse. You need to see and acknowledge that. And I think it's very difficult to create a genuine ethos of progressive change in an organization that ignores the elephant in the room, which is that the people who have power, the people who set culture, the people who make decisions that affect the entire life and future of the company, what do they look like? How diverse are those spaces? How diverse are those rooms? And that's crucial for the culture within the company. It's also, as the data shows, crucial as well for the sustainability of the company, that if diversity isn't reaching the top, then the company is not benefiting from the advantages, both morally and from a business perspective, that diversity brings. So seeing that it's that there is a power structure and understanding how diverse that really is very important, because you lose good faith from people if you don't see that, and then it begins to feel tokenistic. So that's important to say. also understanding how people are affected by career progression and retention, not just celebrating the fact that there are increasingly diverse entry levels, which is obviously something to acknowledge and feel positive about, but looking at how people fare throughout the organization is crucial. Doing the work on the pre-existing culture is an essential underpinning to all of this. And that's the step that too many companies skip because it is uncomfortable and awkward and not what people are used to. But there is a cultural content to an organization. What is it? What is it characterized by? Who are the winners and losers from that pre-existing culture? How can that culture be made more inclusive? That can involve understanding the history of the company in a way that's maybe more frank than has been done, understanding who the board members are, who the clients are, what the marketing narratives are. All of these things kind of come together to inform the culture. And I think seeing that and listening to people with different perspectives about what they see as the culture and how it affects them is really crucial to understanding what the pre-existing culture is. And it's only when you've done those steps, I think you can start making a plan about how to make this a more diverse and inclusive space. And that's a conversation that, again, needs to include everyone. And one thing I see happening is that there are people who self-identify as minorities in organizations, but they often don't feel they can speak. And something that I've experienced many times in my professional life is that I actually go into companies and give talks like this at the invitation of people from minority backgrounds who tell me that I'm saying the things that they want to say, but they can't say them, that they need somebody to come from the outside to say these things because it's safe. Whereas they, again, as I was saying earlier, feel that they face a penalty for saying these things themselves. And I think that it's really important to see that. And I would feel hypocritical or complicit when I give these talks if I don't acknowledge that there are often people within the organization who could deliver the same message, who have the same knowledge and experience, but who don't feel able to speak. And it's really striking how consistently I find that in organizations, that what people will say to me privately about how free they feel to voice their opinion is very different from what they say publicly or what they say among their colleagues or seniors in the organization. So again, we're uncomfortable work, but work that I think is really crucial to do. And then I think there's often a tendency to bring in outside consultants or strategists to make plans about how you can improve diversity and inclusion, and that can be positive. But again, I think it should be second to listening to the people in the company. It's always somehow easier to hear it from the outside. But the people in an organization have the expertise, the best expertise on what's working and what's not working in this respect. And listening to them is really important. So I think those are really crucial steps. And then I would say just embark upon a process of continuous learning. Be reading these books, create book clubs in the organization, create discussions, listen to podcasts, talk about them. Use these materials in an intentional way to improve the quality of the discourse within about diversity, about race, and name the things you're talking about. You know, diversity and inclusion is such an important concept, but within that, there are specific things. You know, Islamophobia is a specific thing, anti-Black racism is a specific thing, anti-Semitism is a specific thing. And sometimes the tendency to lump it all together actually obscures the real issues, just like how the phrase BAME conflates so many people from such different backgrounds, it can become meaningless. You know, people from South Asian heritage often have very different experience, people from West African heritage compared to people from Caribbean heritage. You know, there are many nuances within that are significant enough they deserve their own attention. So letting people self-identify and then seeing how the disparity between those different identities and their experience in the organization is really important. So I think it's drilling down into the actual things, and it should make sense. It's not rocket science. It should mean something to the people in space. And if you find that the language and the concepts have become so abstract and specialized that they couldn't be discussed at the lunch table, then something's gone wrong. And I think it's coming back to that this should mean something to the people in the organization, because that's what it's about.
I like this analogy with lunch table. Yeah, it does tell a lot. So discomfort getting out of the comfort zone, prepare to be not comfortable, listening to people, and safe space. Doesn't seem like a lot, does it? Right? And at the same time, it's everything.
And I think it can be daunting, but it's just putting one step in front of the other, putting one foot in front of the other, reading that book and talking about it, asking questions about the pre-existing culture, advocating for data that shows how diversity changes as you move through different levels in the organization. They're all relatively simple steps that you just take one at a time. And I think, again, having allyship, having a critical mass of people who want and understand the need for that makes all the difference.
I really appreciate your advice, Afua. It's so important to talk, not to stop talking. And I know it might seem easier to hire the outside consultant to highlight certain things, but I believe it's so crucial to talk, to listen, and to make people believe that there are safe spaces. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, and we all are at those places from time to time, but it's amazing how the conversation and listening can change the world.
Absolutely.
I really, really appreciate you here, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. I learned a lot. I'm sure people who were with us and people who will be listening to the recording will also learn a lot. And if you haven't read British, do yourself a favor, pick up a copy. And thank you so much. Please enjoy your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you everyone for watching. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.